How about the Chinese context of CSR? Let's hear from Professor Welford.
Let me go on and talk about some particular topics that are important in Asia very, very briefly. One of them is bribery and corruption. And this is a very interesting table here which shows, I think, a very, very strong correlation between corporate governance and problems over bribery and corruption. Basically, on the left-hand columns, you've got CG Watch's assessment of how good corporate governance is in different countries. So 10 is sort of perfect and 0 is appalling. And then on the right-hand side, you've got Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. The most recent one of those has recently come out, actually. And again, 10 is excellent, 0 is appalling, of course. And you can see a pretty good correlation, I think, here between countries where corporate governance standards are seen as positive and where bribery and corruption is seen to be under control. And for me, there's a very clear message, therefore, for places like Hong Kong. We need to demonstrate to the outside world very, very clearly that our corporate governance at a Hong Kong level really is up to world-class standards. Currently, it isn't. Secondly, I think a big topic is supply chains. To what extent do companies in Hong Kong understand what is going on in their supply chains? I find that this is a huge risk in Hong Kong that many companies take, that many companies are not aware of where they're sourcing their products from. And that is a source of significant embarrassment. Just last week, Tesco, the UK's biggest retailer, in fact, the world's second largest retailer after Walmart, Tesco was accused of having child labour in 2 Bangladeshi factories. This is something that has resonated around. Here's Tesco with very good codes of conduct saying they don't use child labour, but yet a Channel 4 news programme went in with undercover cameras and filmed children as young as 12 years old making clothes for Tesco's. That's a huge reputational damage that has occurred within that organisation. My question is, to every company in Hong Kong, could that same situation happen to you? And if it could, you better do something about it before clever journalists go and uncover where you're sourcing your products from. One of the problems in places like China is that there's very poor regulation in this area. Well, there's good regulation, but there's very poor implementation of regulation. What we often find is that the leading multinational corporations are acting more like policemen than businessmen. Some of the leading sources from China are ensuring that their factories from which they source from are obeying the law, something which local Chinese regulators are not doing. And this is somewhat of an irony that the private sector is now acting like the regulator, and the regulator has gone missing in many, many cases. This is not something that multinational corporations want to do. Most of those great multinational corporations who are doing something in this area have codes of conduct, very strict codes of conduct around employment practices, health and safety, environmental issues, making sure that workers are paid enough money and paid on time, which is a big issue at the moment in China. And if you ask those multinational corporations whether those codes of conduct are working, the ones who are honest with you will say no. And the reason is that factories cheat. They keep multiple sets of records. They coach their workers to give auditors the right answers to the usual questions.
Professor Welford argues that global stakeholders in Chinese companies are increasingly likely to draw links between poor corporate governance and perceived bribery and corruption. Now, let's hear how Professor Welford concludes by looking at the future development of CSR.
Let me wrap up and talk a little bit about the future. Good corporate governance means we are requiring more transparency. We need to look more like that vacuum cleaner and less secretive. And I think there's a role of regulators. I think regulators still should be doing more. I think we need more regulation in most of Asia, in fact, in all of Asia, I think, and I think we're likely to get that as well. I think we're going to see the further development of CSR and corporate governance standards, possibly at a regional level within the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. There's quite a lot of discussion now about having common standards for CSR and corporate governance across those 10 member countries. Standards are becoming soft law. Soft law can result in you being prosecuted in court for not doing what might be seen as responsible and best practice. We are going to see more and more shareholder activism, like the shareholders insisting Freeport does a human rights audit. We're going to see stakeholder activism. We are seeing a growing and sophisticated civil society within Asia, and I think, therefore, we're going to find ourselves being put under much, much more pressure from NGOs, civil society organizations. And now we're going to need a lot more capacity amongst non-executive directors and managers to deal with those issues. What I would like to see in the future is many more proper independent non-executive directors. And I think that still is an issue for places like Hong Kong. We need to see both responsibility but also accountability. And I think there's a difference between simply being responsible and proving that you're being responsible, which is for me what is being accountable, that you really are showing that you're walking the talk. Companies, I think, should be involved in two-way stakeholder dialogues, both listening to your stakeholders, but also talking to your stakeholders about when you have good principles and good practices that are sometimes better than theirs. And stakeholders are not always right. Stakeholders themselves have to be educated sometimes to sort of move with good corporate governance and good CSR. Increasingly, I think we should be adhering to international standards. Those new International Finance Corporation standards really do set the agenda for me for the next 10 years. And those IFC standards have now been translated into the Equator Principles, the new Equator Principles for bank lending. And the level at which those Equator Principles apply for new projects has been reduced from $50 million to only $10 million. You know, that's not a very big factory, $10 million. It's not a very big building. And so if you want to get financing from those banks, you're going to have to meet those standards. And lastly, we need much more disclosure. We need much more reporting. It's no coincidence, to my mind, that the leading companies in Hong Kong on corporate social responsibility, on the environment, are also the companies that are reporting and are disclosing and are producing evidence that they are actually walking the talk.
As you have heard, Professor Welford believes that CSR is strongly dependent on better corporate governance and greater transparency and disclosure. He also sees greater accountability becoming central to good CSR. Now, let's shift our focus to an international case of CSR application, Starbucks.